silver mining valley in the Idaho high country, 200 souls smoked under a sky, the color of a fresh bruise, and every chimney breathed as though nothing were coming. Then the geese knifed south, 3 weeks too early. On a slope above the town, a narrow seam in the rock exhaled a breath of air that was not quite as cruel as the world around it, and a girl of 17 stood before it with a sack of potatoes on her back and frost already in her hair. She had been crossed off a list, one line of ink through two words, and a door shut behind her. Below her, the valley laughed at the strange girl hauling supplies to a hole in a hill. They did not see the clouds stacking in the north. They did not feel the wind change direction twice in a single week. And they did not know that when the worst storm the valley had ever seen came down out of those mountains, the only warm door left standing would belong to the one person they had thrown into the snow. The first thing Maren Pascoe carried up the hill was a sack of potatoes. Not blankets, not firewood, not the good wool coat she had outgrown 2 winters back and should have sold when she still had a buyer for it. Potatoes, because hunger frightened her more than cold, and she had learned that lesson the way animals learn which berries kill, through suffering and the narrow luck of surviving it. 3 weeks of sleeping in frozen sheds and beneath abandoned wagons had taught her that cold only makes a person miserable, but hunger makes a person stupid. And stupid in an Idaho winter gets you buried before the ground has even finished freezing. She dragged the heavy sack across the iron-hard earth while sleet ticked against the rocks overhead, a dry insect sound, like fingernails tapping the underside of a coffin lid. Boots slipped twice on the narrow path that climbed toward the seam in the hillside, and the second time she nearly lost the whole sack over the edge, nearly watched 60 pounds of survival tumble down the slope into the brush where she would never have found it again in the failing light. She caught the trailing rope at the last second. Her fingers burned. Her shoulders screamed in their sockets. She held on anyway because letting go had already cost her everything once, and she had decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that she was finished letting go of things. Below her, the valley of Sable Creek smoked under a darkening sky. Maybe 200 souls lived down there, spread across a huddle of timber houses, a church with a steeple that leaned a few degrees off true, a supply store, a blacksmith's shop breathing its orange breath into the dusk, and the played-out bones of a silver and lead mine that had once kept the whole settlement fed. The mine was nearly dead now. Half the men who used to descend into it had drifted south to Boise or west toward the coast, chasing the next strike. The ones who stayed farmed thin, stony soil and cut timber and told each other the good years might circle back if they only waited long enough. Winter was coming early this time. Everyone felt it in their teeth. The geese had already knifed south in ragged formations. The wind had swung around twice in a single week, tasting of something metallic and far away. That was why they had thrown her out before the snow came. Not because they hated her. Hatred would have been easier to bear, because hatred can be argued with. They threw her out because the arithmetic did not balance. And Silas Renner was a man who trusted arithmetic the way other men trusted scripture. 3 weeks earlier, she had stood in the kitchen of the house she had lived in. For 2 years, the house that belonged to the man her mother had married 14 months after Maren's father went into the ground. Silas stood on the far side of the table. He did not shout. That was the thing she kept returning to, the detail that lodged under her ribs like a splinter working its slow way toward the bone. He did not raise his voice even a little. He simply laid a single sheet of paper flat against the wood and waited for her to read it, the way a bank clerk waits for a man to understand the figure at the bottom of a ledger. She read it. A column of numbers ran down the left side in Silas's careful, upright hand, an inventory of everything the house held against the coming cold: flour and salt and lamp oil, cordwood and dried venison, and the last of the autumn's canned squash. On the right side ran the mouths that food had to keep breathing until spring, and beneath both columns a line of subtraction, clean and merciless. The numbers did not meet in the middle, and beside one name in the household's list, someone had drawn a single horizontal stroke, a thin line of ink, through two words: Maren Pascoe. There isn't enough. Silas's voice was flat as the paper itself, a man reading a bill of sale to a stranger. Not enough wood, not enough food, not enough of anything to carry 4 through to the thaw. You can see the figures for yourself. I'm not asking you to go. I'm showing you why someone has to. She looked at her mother. Ruth sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards, as though it might open and offer her somewhere to fall. Twisted into the fabric of her skirt and pulled it tight enough that the knuckles stood out white as bone through the skin. Maren waited for her to say something. Anything. A single word of protest, one syllable of objection, and she would have dug her heels into that floor and fought to stay through every argument Silas could muster. But Ruth never lifted her gaze from the knot in the wood. My father died in that mine. Maren was surprised to hear how steady her own voice came out, steadier than the storm building behind her eyes. Tomas Pascoe went underground so this valley could have silver and this house could have wages. He died down in the Widowmaker Drift 2 years ago. Him and 3 other men because the company wanted them to chase the vein another 40 feet past where the timbering was sound. Now his daughter isn't worth the ink it takes to keep her name on your list. Silas did not flinch. He had the stillness of a man who had already run every objection through his figures and found them wanting. Your father died because he took a risk a careful man wouldn't have taken. I don't intend to repeat his arithmetic. The sentence landed harder than any slap could have, and not because it was cruel, though it was that too. It landed hard because Silas believed it. He believed, down in the marrow of him, that Tomas Pascoe's death had been a miscalculation rather than a sacrifice, an error in judgment rather than a man refusing to leave others behind in the dark. He believed that survival was a sum and nothing more, that a life could be set on the same scale as a barrel of flour and found either worth the shelf space or not. Maren looked at her mother one last time. Ruth's lips parted. The ghost of a word gathered there and never quite became sound. Then her jaw tightened and her eyes closed, and the moment folded shut like a book no one intended to open again. Maren understood something in that silence that she would spend the whole winter learning to say properly. Her mother was not heartless. Her mother was hollowed. 3 brutal winters, a husband lost to the earth, a second marriage entered out of nothing but the arithmetic of a widow, with no wages and no prospects. The slow grinding erosion of poverty that wears a person down the way water wears stone. All of it had scooped Ruth out from the inside, until silence was the only thing she had left to offer anyone, her own daughter included. Understanding it did not make it hurt any less. Maren had learned that too in those 3 weeks. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and neither one fills an empty stomach. She packed what she could carry into 2 canvas sacks, a change of clothes, the heavy shawl her father had given her. The winter she turned 15, the wool still smelling faintly of the pipe smoke that had hung about him. Folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth by his thumb. A handful of coins, saved from mending work she took in from the men who had no wives to darn their socks. A small leather pouch holding a lock of her father's hair, cut before they closed the lid on him. And last, because she almost forgot it, and then could not imagine leaving it behind, the sticking Tommy from the shelf by the door, the iron candle holder her father had carried down into the mine every working morning of his life, its spike blackened by 12 years of being driven into rock, so a flame could light the place where he swung his pick. She wrapped her fingers around the cold iron and felt, for just a moment, the ghost of his grip beneath her own. She walked out before the sun finished setting. She did not say goodbye. The porch steps groaned under her boots, the same 3 notes they always did, and the gate swung shut behind her with the familiar iron squeal it had made every day of the 2 years she had lived there. And she did not look back down the road toward the house, because looking back would have meant admitting she still half hoped someone would come after her. Nobody came. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and darkening, and Maren Pascoe walked into it with everything she owned, slung across her shoulders, and a sensation in her chest like a door being nailed shut from the inside. By the following dawn, the snow had already begun. The first 3 nights very nearly finished what Silas's arithmetic had started. An abandoned equipment shed near the mouth of the old mine, cold enough that her breath crystallized in the light of the little grease lamp she nursed. the wind whistling through the gaps between the wall planks all night while mice scratched and rustled in the corners, and her own teeth chattered a rhythm she could not stop. The next night, under a wagon behind the feedlot, where something with a cold tail ran across her legs at midnight, and the frozen ground seemed to reach up through the burlap she lay on and pull the warmth straight out of her bones. The third night, in a root cellar, someone had forgotten to bar, damp and lightless, and stinking of turnips gone soft, where she slept sitting upright against the earthen wall because the floor was too wet to lie down on. Each morning the cold had crept a little deeper into her. Each morning she woke more exhausted than she had lain down. Her joints stiffened. Her thoughts came slower, arriving late and leaving early. On the third morning, she caught herself standing in the middle of the road with her mind gone entirely white, staring at nothing, unable to remember which direction she had meant to walk, and the realization frightened her more than the cold ever had. The cold was reaching past her skin now, into the room where decisions lived, and it was going along the walls, turning down the lamps one by one. She had watched a trapped animal do the same thing once. Simply stop. Simply sit down in the snow and let go. She understood now what that stillness had been. It had not been peace. It had been the mind consenting to its own ending because thinking had become too much work. She had tried to ask for help before it came to that. On the second evening, she had knocked on Corbin Wade's door. Corbin was a quiet man, a widower, raising a 7-year-old boy named Micah on his own, with gentle eyes and hands cracked and darkened from splitting other men's cordwood for pay. He looked genuinely sorry when he told her he had no room to give. She could see past him into the single cramped room where Micah sat at the table, working sums on a slate by lamplight. And she knew Corbin was telling the plain truth, that the house held 2 rooms and barely enough of them for 2 people. But he pressed a wedge of cornbread into her hand before she turned to go, still warm from the pan, and the heat of it against her frozen palm nearly undid her right there on his doorstep. She had tried the church next, but the door was locked, and Reverend Absalom Reed had gone to Boise to buy the winter's supplies before the passes closed. Wife, Lavinia, opened the parsonage door and let Maren sleep one night on the bench beside the stove. Lavinia was a careful woman of 50-odd years, her steel gray hair pinned back tight, her voice carrying the settled authority of someone long accustomed to being the moral compass in a settlement full of men who worshiped the practical above all else. In the morning, she brought Maren a cup of coffee and spoke plainly over the rim of her own. "If I let you stay past one night, others will ask why I didn't do the same for them. Then every family down on their luck will form a line at this door, and I cannot shelter the whole valley. So I cannot shelter only one." She set her cup down with the finality of a woman closing a ledger. "You understand me." Maren understood. It was the same logic Silas had used, only dressed in kinder clothes and served with coffee. She thanked Lavinia for the warmth and left before the sun cleared the ridge. On the fourth morning, hunting the hillside above town for fallen branches dry enough to burn, she found the crack in the rock. It was not an obvious thing, a narrow seam half hidden behind a leaning slab of stone and a curtain of dead brush, a third of the way up a slope that overlooked the whole valley. 100 people could have walked past it and never turned their heads. But Maren noticed what stopped them from noticing. The air near the seam was wrong. Not warm, nothing so generous as warm, only less cruel, a faint breath of something other than the frozen world, exhaling from between the stones as though the hill itself were breathing slow and shallow in its sleep. She thought of her father. Maren Pascoe had gone underground every working morning for 12 years, descending with a lantern and a pick into a darkness that stayed exactly the same, no matter what the sky above was doing. He had told her once, with her perched on his knee and no older than Micah Wade was now, that the deep places of the earth kept their own weather. Underground doesn't care what the calendar says, he had told her, tamping his pipe with a thumb stained the color of coal dust. Summer or the dead of January, the rock holds whatever warmth it wants and pays no mind to any of us up top. She had been too young then to do anything with the knowledge but nod. Now standing before a breathing crack in a hillside with frost in her hair and no roof anywhere in the world that would take her, she understood it perfectly. She crawled inside with the grease lamp held out ahead of her. an old jar packed with cooking fat and a twist of rag for a wick. The passage was tight for the first 10 feet, close enough to scrape both her shoulders raw at once, and then, without warning, it opened. The chamber beyond ran deeper than the lamplight could reach, dry and still, the ceiling arching high enough overhead that she could stand upright with room to spare. Along the curve of stone above her, faint black smudges marked where fires had burned long ago. Against one wall, flat stones had been arranged into a fire pit, deliberate, shaped by human hands and not by any accident of geology. Directly above the pit, a narrow fissure ran up through the ceiling, and when she held the lamp beneath it, she felt the faint upward pull of a natural chimney, drawing smoke toward the open sky. Someone had lived here. Someone who had understood winter the way she was only beginning to. She sat on the cold stone floor for the better part of an hour, doing nothing but listening. No wind found its way inside. No snow. No exposed corner where the warmth of a fire could leak away into the dark. Only still, dry air, and the faint mineral smell of deep rock, the same smell that had clung to her father's clothes every evening of her childhood. And in that stillness, a realization settled over her that was equal parts salvation and sentence. She could live here, she could actually survive. The thought did not comfort her. It frightened her because surviving in a cave on a hillside above a town that had cast her out meant stepping outside the boundaries of every ordinary future she had ever imagined for herself. It meant becoming something other than a 17-year-old girl waiting on a porch for someone to have room for her. It meant taking her own existence into her own two hands in a way that no one in Sable Creek, man or woman, had offered to help her carry. She noticed one last thing before she crawled back out into the cold. On the far wall, deep in the chamber, where the lamplight only barely reached, someone had cut marks into the stone with a blade. Hundreds of small vertical lines, grouped patiently in sets of 7, and beside them, scratched faint but still legible, a date. November 1853, 30 years gone. Whoever had sheltered here had counted the weeks, many and many of them, one careful stroke at a time. Maren stared at those marks and felt two things at once, and both of them were true. Hope, because the cave had plainly kept a person alive before, and a colder thing beneath the hope, because whoever had made those marks had eventually stopped making them, and she had no way of knowing why. She returned the next morning carrying the first load, potatoes, before anything else because hunger still frightened her more than any other thing the world could do to her. Then canned peaches, bought with nearly the last of her coins from a farmer's wife on the outskirts who had not yet heard. She was someone a person wasn't supposed to sell to. Then blankets stiff with dust and mouse gnawed at the edges, but still thick enough to trap heat, scavenged from a collapsed trapper's shack down near the creek. Trip drained her to the last drop. The cave sat the better part of a mile from town, uphill through terrain that would only turn crueler as the snow deepened. By the third day, her shoulders had bruised purple beneath the rope that bit into them, and her hands had cracked open across the knuckles, and a blister on her right heel had burst and reformed, and burst again until the skin there hardened into something closer to leather than to flesh. But each time she set down a load inside the chamber and looked at the growing rampart of supplies against the stone, something hard and certain settled deeper into her chest, a foundation being poured beneath a house no one else could see her building. People noticed quickly. Small towns always notice. Cade Marsh spotted her first, hauling a makeshift sled piled with grain sacks toward the hills on the fourth morning. Cade was the settlement's blacksmith, 31 years old, broad through the shoulders as the anvil he worked, and absolutely certain about every subject the Lord had ever created. He had the kind of voice that carried across open ground, whether he intended it to or not, and he used it the way some men use their fists, to fill a silence before anyone else could claim it. "What in the world are you doing out there?" His shout rolled up the slope from the road. She kept pulling, preparing. For what exactly? She let her eyes travel up to the low gray belly of the sky. For winter. He looked at the overloaded sled, then back at her, and something in his certainty curdled into contempt. "You planning to live out in the woods like a wild thing?" "If I have to." He stared after her a while, then shook his head. and turned back toward his forge. "Girl's gone half feral already," he muttered, pitched exactly loud enough to be sure it reached her. But Maren kept walking, and she noticed with a small dark satisfaction that she had stopped caring what Cade Marsh thought of her at some point between the shed and the wagon and the root cellar. Somewhere in the stretch of nights, when not one of these certain, well-housed men had offered her so much as a corner of a floor. Every day she hauled more. Flour, salted meat, lamp oil, matches sealed in waxed cloth against the damp, empty buckets for melting snow into drinking water. She organized it all inside the chamber with a precision that surprised even her. Food along the colder rear wall, where the temperature held lowest and steadiest. Firewood stacked near the entrance, where the moving air kept it dry. Blankets raised off the stone floor on a low platform of lashed branches, so the cold of the ground could not steal the warmth out of her while she slept. She notched shelves together from fallen timber and scavenged planks, working the joints with her father's folding knife until they held without a nail. The cave was becoming something, not something comfortable. She had no illusions about comfort, but something functional. A machine built for the single purpose of keeping one person alive through the dark months. Ambrose Thorne noticed the change in her buying before anyone else, because Ambrose Thorne noticed everything that touched money. He owned the only general store within 30 miles and sat on the three-man town council, which in practice meant that Ambrose and two men who agreed with whatever Ambrose said governed the whole of Sable Creek. He was 46, lean in the face, with pale eyes that appraised the worth of everything they landed on, people included. He wore pressed shirts even in the mud of late autumn, as though respectability were a garment he could not afford to let wrinkle. He kept the store's true ledger in a locked drawer he opened only when he was certain he was alone. He caught her outside the store the morning she came to buy flour. "You've been buying a good deal more than a girl in your circumstances has any call to." He leaned in the doorframe with his arms folded, blocking the warmth that leaked out from within. "Other families lay in stores for winter. I'm paying your full price, same as any of them." He lowered his voice to the register men use for threats they want to sound like reason. "I hold the right to refuse a sale if I judge someone's hoarding in a manner that harms the community's supply. The council stands behind me on that." He looked at him steadily, and she understood exactly what she was looking at. Ambrose Thorne did not care one whit for the community's welfare. Ambrose Thorne cared for control, and his control ran entirely through the shelves behind him. Every family in the valley depended on his store, because there was no other within a hard day's ride. If Maren Pascoe proved she could feed and warm herself without ever crossing his threshold, then she existed outside the system he had spent years constructing, and a person outside the system was a crack in a foundation Ambrose had assumed was solid. She bought her flour that day, but she walked away understanding that the supply line could be cut at his whim, and that she had best gather everything she could while the gathering was still allowed. As she stepped back into the cold, a hand caught her sleeve. Della Thorne, 19 years old, the closest thing to a true friend Maren had owned before her whole life came apart. Della had her father's sharp features, but none of his sharpness turned inward on the world. Where Ambrose's face was a closed drawer, his daughter's was a window with the curtains drawn back. He pulled Maren around the corner of the building, out of the sightline of the store's front glass, and pressed a cloth bundle into her hands. "Salt pork. Take it, and don't argue." Della's eyes flicked back toward the corner. "He counts the flour and the sugar down to the ounce, but he's never once counted the pork. He won't miss it." She hesitated, then said the thing that had plainly been sitting behind her teeth. "He doesn't hate you, Maren. He's afraid of you. If a girl he cut off can live through a winter on her own two hands, so folks might start to wonder whether they need him half as badly as he spent his whole life making them believe." It was a sharp thing to see, and Della was not a foolish girl. She was a trapped one, a daughter caught between the blood loyalty she had been raised to and a conscience she had never quite managed to silence. Maren took the pork and said nothing worth saying, but she held Della's cold hand a moment before letting it go, and Della squeezed back, and in that brief grip passed everything neither of them could say aloud in a town where Ambrose Thorne kept his ears pressed to every wall. 2 days later, she saw the thing Della's words had only pointed toward. She had come down at dusk to fill her water buckets at the creek behind the store, moving quiet out of the habit poverty teaches. And through the small rear window of Thorne's stockroom, she saw the man himself by lamplight. He was not tending the shelves the town could see. He was in the back, stacking sacks of flour and slabs of salt pork into a separate pile behind a false partition of new lumber, driving fresh nails into fresh boards, sealing a private store within the public one. He worked with the furtive economy of a man who has told himself a story about scarcity so many times he's come to believe he is its only deserving survivor. Stood in the blue dark with her empty buckets and watched him build a wall between what the valley thought it could count on and what he had quietly set aside for himself alone. She said nothing. She told no one but Della later, and Della only closed her eyes and nodded, because she had already known. Odessa Kell was the one person in Sable Creek who never once laughed at her. The old widow, 68 and thin as a split rail, watched Maren buying dried beans one evening from a farmer at the edge of town. She came near without a sound and asked simply whether the girl had found shelter. Maren hesitated, then gave a single nod. Odessa studied her the way a woman studies a sky she has learned to read across 60 hard years. Underground? The word landed like a hand on the back of the neck. How could you know that? Because underground is a great deal smarter than freezing. Odessa handed her 2 extra jars of peach preserves without another word about it. And then, before she turned to go, she said the thing Maren would carry with her through every frozen night that followed. The winter I was 12 years old, my family got caught out on the trail west, snowed in 3 weeks, short of anywhere. My mother kept the 4 of us breathing by burning the wagon down to its axles, one board at a time. The sideboards first, then the seat, then the wheels themselves. Her eyes, gone pale as creek ice, settled on Maren without any pity in them, only a hard and useful clarity. I have never in my life been afraid of winter, child. I am afraid of people who refuse to prepare for it. Ambrose made it official 2 weeks before the first true snowfall. He refused to sell to her outright. Council decision. He set it across the counter with the store empty. But for the two of them, the smell of lamp oil and dried corn hanging in the air between them. Resources are limited this year. Priority goes to established families with standing accounts. Maren left without arguing, because there was nothing on the far side of an argument with Ambrose Thorne, but more of Ambrose Thorne. The council was Ambrose and 2 echoes, but the door swinging shut behind her sounded less like a refusal now, and more like a lock turning, a bolt sliding home around the whole valley with only Ambrose holding the key. She was cut off from provisions entirely. Whatever already sat inside the cave, whatever she could snare or dig from the frozen ground, that was the whole of it now, from here until the thaw. That evening, Della met her on the road beyond the last house, in the failing light, and pressed a small sack of sugar and salt into her hands. He finds out I took this from the stockroom. She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. Then don't risk it. Maren tried to give it back. You'll get thrown out same as me. I know. Della's face was hard to read in the dusk, but her voice did not waver. I just can't stand in that house one more day and watch him decide who in this valley gets to eat and who doesn't. Maren solved the problem the way her father would have. She set snares for rabbits along the ridgeline, using loops of the good rope that had begun appearing mysteriously at the mouth of the cave. She dug for roots beneath the thin early snow, cattail and burdock and wild bulbs, knowledge that came up out of the deep well of her childhood, out of long, idle afternoons in these same hills with Maren Pascoe when the mind sat quiet, and he taught her the name and the use of every green thing worth the eating. Cattail root, Maren. He would say, prying one loose from the black mud along the creek. Wash it, roast it over the coals. Won't win any prizes for flavor, but it keeps a body upright. His voice came back to her whole and unbroken each time she knelt in the frozen earth and worked a root free, and she could see his hands, rough and copper-stained, breaking the root open to show her the pale flesh inside, and she could hear him humming that tuneless hum he always fell into when he was teaching her something that mattered, as though the humming helped the lesson settle into her for good. He had been 2 years dead. Some mornings it felt like 200, and some mornings it felt like he had only just stepped out the door and might yet come back through it. And she never could decide which of those mornings was the crueler. A week after she settled into the cave, she woke before dawn to find boot prints frozen into the frost outside the entrance. Large boots, a long stride. Her stomach dropped, and she reached for the knife before she was fully awake. She crawled out into the gray light with the blade in her fist and found no one. But hanging from a low branch beside the cave mouth was a rabbit, freshly killed and already dressed, still faintly warm, and beside it a fresh coil of the same good rope. No note, no sign at all of who had left it. The gifts came 3 more times over the following fortnight. A square of tanned deer hide, clean and supple, a box of matches sealed in waxed cloth, a small hatchet with a short handle, the kind a man who lived by the trap line would carry on his belt. Each time, the same large boot prints pressed into the frost. Each time, nothing else. No word, no face, no reason offered. She asked Odessa about the marks on the cave wall, the hundreds of tallies grouped by sevens and the date cut beside them. The old woman went quiet a long moment before she answered. Could be Ransom Teal did that. A fur trapper. Lived up in these mountains alone for more years than most men could stand before he ever came down to the valley. Folks say he's odd, and folks aren't wrong. She paused, weighing whether to say the rest. But there's not a living soul in this country who understands a hard winter better than he does. Is he dangerous? He's lonely. Odessa's mouth pulled sideways. That's a different kind of dangerous, and I'd not care to say which kind is worse. Maren decided to learn the truth of it for herself. She rose in the black before dawn and waited outside the cave mouth. The knife in her coat, her breath smoking, the cold working its slow way in through the soles of her boots. She waited 2 hours before she heard the crunch of a heavy tread on frozen ground. He came up through the trees without hurry, carrying something, and stopped a good 30 yards short of the entrance. He did not approach. Instead, he lowered himself onto a flat rock near the frozen creek bed, set his bundle on the ground beside him, and waited, plainly expecting her to come to him rather than the other way around. She approached with one hand on the knife. He was older than she had pictured, 57 perhaps, thin and weathered as a fence post, left out through a decade of seasons, a gray beard grown wild for want of trimming, a coat of worn deerskin patched at both elbows. He did not turn his head as she drew near. You're using the rope to snare rabbits. His voice came out rough and rusted, a hinge that had gone years without oil. That's good. Most folks would have hanged themselves with it by now. Why are you helping me? Now he turned, and his eyes were calm, but there was a sadness worn so deep into them it had stopped being sorrow and become simply the shape of the man, the way certain old dogs look when they have been left alone one season too many. 30 years back, I was the first person to live in that cave. The tallies on the wall are mine. Every mark is a week I made it through. He tipped his head toward the hillside behind her, the winter of 53 and the one that followed it. 2 winters I counted out on that stone, one line at a time. Then why did you leave? Ransom looked at her a long, still moment before he answered. Because when a man lives alone long enough, he starts talking to the stone. And after a while longer, the stone starts answering him back. He let that sit. I got no wish to watch that happen to you. He taught her one thing before he left that morning, and only one. He showed her how to lay the firewood in a fan around the pit so the surrounding stone drank the heat evenly and gave it back slow through the long hours after the flames died. He explained the principle once cleanly, the way a man explains a thing he has tested against his own survival and found true. The rock holds warmth the way a good iron skillet holds it after you've pulled it off the stove, he told her, slow and steady, for hours after the fire's gone to coals. Build small. A small fire throws less smoke and burns less of what you can't replace. Dry wood above all else. Smoke's the enemy, girl. Always. Smoke tells the whole valley where you are. And worse, smoke steals the very air you're trying to breathe. It was the only time anyone would ever put the mechanics of it into words for her. After that, it would simply be a thing Maren knew, carried in her hands rather than her ears, proven in her actions rather than repeated in anyone's speech. By the tail end of autumn, Sable Creek had grown uneasy. The geese had gone early and gone all at once. The wind swung around without warning and came back tasting of iron. Frost hard enough to kill the last standing crops arrived overnight, weeks before anyone had reckoned on it. The men at the diner took to discussing the coming snowfall in low, worried voices over their morning coffee, before they'd even touched their eggs. Feels wrong this year, too quiet by half, something building up north, you can smell it. Maren heard them from the corner where she sat warming her raw hands at the stove, buying nothing, saying nothing, invisible again the way the poor are always invisible until someone needs a target. Then she climbed back up to the cave and doubled her firewood. Aid Marsh saw her again near the store, loading yet another sack of potatoes onto her sled, bought from the same farmer's wife on the outskirts who still quietly would sell to her. He laughed, though there was less certainty in it than there had been a month before. Stocking food enough for an army up there. Maren cinched the rope tight, just enough for a winter. You can't hide in a hole in a hill till spring, girl. She looked past him toward the mountains, where the peaks had already vanished, behind a wall of iron-gray cloud that had not been there at sunrise. Watch me. Ambrose's band spread outward from his own counter like frost creeping across a window pane. He spoke to the three farming families who had been selling to Maren directly and let them understand that the council would look unkindly on continued trade with her. Two of the three stopped that same week. Only the Wades held out. Corbin and his boy went right on leaving a small sack of dried corn beside the trail marker at the base of the hill every Thursday without a word, without ever once being thanked to his face. Maren told no one about it. Some debts a person repays by remembering, and she meant to remember this one for the rest of her life. One evening, as the northern sky bruised to the color of a week-old wound, Odessa stopped her on the road. The old woman's breath came in thin, quick clouds, and her eyes were fixed on the far horizon. Big storm coming. She said it barely above a whisper, the way you'd speak in a sick room. How big? Odessa lifted her chin toward the pale north, where the clouds had begun to stack themselves in dark, heavy layers, unlike anything Maren had seen in all her 17 years. Big enough that folks with any sense should have started laying in a month ago. Big enough I can feel it in the old break in my wrist, and that bone has never once lied to me. Maren thought of the ramparts of supplies, stacked safe and dry inside the cave, the shelves she had built, with her own split and bleeding hands, the firewood laid in its precise rows, the potatoes along the cold rear wall, the jerky hanging from hooks she had carved into the living rock, the blankets raised up off the floor. 3 months of labor by a girl the whole valley had written off as surplus. Then she thought of the 200 people down in that darkening valley, still going about their evenings as though this winter would arrive gentle as every winter before it. The men in the diner who talked storm totals but never once changed a single thing they actually did. She felt two things at the same moment, and both were true, and the pair of them sat uneasily together in her chest. Relief that she had prepared, and a low, unwelcome guilt for feeling the relief, because she could not be glad of her own readiness without being glad, in some buried and shameful way, of everyone else's blindness. The next morning she walked into the diner during the hour when most of the men were gathered over their plates. She stood near the door, still in her frost-dusted coat, and spoke loud enough to carry to every table. A bad storm's coming, not an ordinary one. You should double your wood and your food stores now. Today, before the roads get worse than they already are. Ambrose sat near the window with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He looked at her and smiled the smile a man gives a stray dog that has wandered somewhere it doesn't belong. The girl who lives in a hole in the ground has come to teach us all how to keep house for the winter, and her without so much as a roof. Cade, at the next table over, added his weight to it. If it's as bad as all that, we've got timber houses and cast iron stoves down here. What have you got up there? A crack in a rock? A few of the men laughed. Not all. Corbin stared down into his coffee and said nothing at all, and Maren saw the shame move across his quiet face like a cloud shadow crossing a field. Lavinia Reed, who had come in to buy bread, offered her correction in that measured, reasonable voice of hers, the voice that made unkindness sound like wisdom. Maren, dear, The men in this room have lived through more winters than you have been alive to see." Maren looked around the room one last time. She let her eyes rest on every face in turn. She was not doing it out of spite, though a lesser part of her wanted to. She was doing it because she had a sudden certainty that within a handful of days, some of these faces would be wearing a very different expression. And she wanted to remember exactly how sure of themselves they looked now, before the sky proved every one of them wrong. Then she turned and walked out, and nobody followed her, and nobody called after her to ask what Odessa had seen or what her own two eyes had read in the stacking clouds. She climbed back up the hill through the first thin flurries of what would become the worst storm the valley had ever recorded, and she did not look back. That night, alone in the chamber with the fan of firewood glowing down to coals, she sat and listened to the wind begin to change its voice. Not yet the storm, only its outrider, the low sound a river makes in the hours before the flood arrives, the vibration you feel in your back teeth before it ever reaches your ears. She had told them. They had laughed. And in the dark of that stone room, a question began to take its shape. Quiet and cold and patient, the question that would come to define everything that followed. When the storm broke, and it came for them the way she knew it would, and the people who had thrown her out into the snow began pounding on the door of the world for someone to let them in, what would she do? Would she open this cave to the men who had laughed at her father's grave and crossed her name off a list? Or would she become, at last and forever, exactly the kind of person who had thrown her away? The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday night, and it did not arrive gently. Maren was banking the last of her coals when she felt it come, not as sound at first, but as pressure, a change in the weight of the air that made her ears ache and pulled the flame of her grease lamp sideways, though she could feel no draft anywhere in the chamber. Then the sound caught up with the pressure, a roar so deep and sustained it seemed to rise out of the mountain's own belly, rather than fall from the sky above it. The lamp flame steadied. The stone walls did not so much as tremble. And beyond the tight passage, the world she had known her whole life came apart at every seam. Snow did not fall that night. It attacked. It drove sideways in sheets so thick and so fast that within the first hour, the mouth of the cave had sealed itself behind a white wall of moving ice, and Maren could hear the storm spending its fury against the hillside, a sustained hammering against timber and glass and against anything foolish enough to still be standing upright down in the valley. She sat wrapped in two blankets, feeding the fire one careful stick at a time, and listened to the cave absorb the violence the way deep water absorbs a thrown stone. Completely, without effort, without acknowledgement. That was the thing that frightened her. Not the storm itself, but the cave's indifference to it. Because if the chamber barely registered a force like this, then the destruction on the far side of that white wall was worse than anything she had let herself imagine, and 200 people had prepared for an ordinary winter. She did not sleep. She sat with her spine against the cold rock and her eyes on the sealed entrance, and she turned the question over and over in the dark. She thought of her father, and she knew without so much hesitation what Maren Pascoe would have done. He would already be halfway down the slope with a lantern in one fist and a coil of rope over his shoulder and his coat hanging open because he'd have given his scarf to whoever needed it worse. That was the whole of the man. The kind who went deeper into a failing drift because he'd a voice calling from the dark. The kind who died precisely because he had never once in his life learned how to walk away from another person's trouble. Maren was not certain she was made of the same stuff. She was not certain she wanted to be. Being made of that stuff had put her father in the ground. Near dawn, a shape appeared at the entrance, forcing its way through the packed snow, too tall and too broad to be anyone she wanted to meet with her guard down. She had the knife in her hand before her mind caught up to her body, and she pressed herself flat against the wall beside the passage. The shape crawled through on hands and knees, shedding clumps of snow, and rose into the firelight, shaking itself like a dog come in from a river. Ransom teal, ice-crusted white in his beard, his deerskin coat gone dark with melt. He looked at her with an expression that was neither calm nor afraid, but something poised between the two. The face of a man who has already seen what is coming and understood that it will not be talked out of arriving. came up through the low end of town on my way. Here he shook the snow from his sleeves and let it hiss against the coals. Roof of the church tore open on the north side, first hour of it. Wade's chimneys, packed solid with drift. They can't get a fire to draw. He lowered himself near the flames, holding his scarred hands over the heat. This keeps on past 3 days, and folks down there start freezing in their own kitchens. Maren set the knife down on the shelf. You came to tell me I ought to help them. He looked at her across the small fire, and there was no judgment in it, only a weariness that had settled into him decades before she was born. I came because it's a sight warmer in here than in my cabin, and my cabin lost the better part of its roof, about the time yours lost its steeple. A dry pause. But since you've gone and asked me, yes, I'd think on it if I were you. They laughed at me, Ransom. Every last one of them. Ambrose cut off my supplies before the first flake fell. Lavinia told me I was a child who didn't know better. Cade said I'd gone wild. My own mother stood at that table and watched me walk out and never opened her mouth. I know it. Then you know I don't owe a single one of them anything. You don't. He agreed to it without hesitation, which was somehow worse than if he had argued. Not a thing in this world. Then tell me why I should pull that snow away from the door. Ransom was quiet a long while. The fire cracked and threw a coal that he crushed under his boot without looking at it. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone lower and slower, as though the words had been waiting 30 years for someone to sit still long enough to hear them. 30 years back, I sat exactly where you're sitting now. Same cave, same kind of storm, though I'll grant you, this one's meaner than mine was. He worked his jaw as if the memory had a taste. I had food enough for one, wood enough for one, and I knew, sure as I know my own name, that there were people down in that valley, cold and scared and coming up short. I sat right here and I chose not to dig out that door. I told myself it was prudence. I stayed inside and I waited for the winter to pass me by. And it passed. It passed. Nobody died that year, as it happened. The storm wasn't quite bad enough to take anyone. His eyes came up to hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, they held something that looked almost like fear. But I didn't know that while it was happening, girl. For 6 days I sat on this stone, not knowing whether somebody was freezing a mile below me, while I ate hot soup and slept warm and dry. And when the thaw came and I learned they'd all made it, that didn't set me free. Because I'd already found out the thing about myself. I'd already learned. I was the kind of man who'd let the door stay shut and give the shutting a respectable name. A log settled in the coals with a soft collapse. I've carried that question up and down these mountains for 30 years. He said it to the fire more than to her. Every winter it comes back and sits down next to me. What if the storm had been worse? What if someone had gone under while I stayed warm? What if I could have changed the whole shape of a life just by moving some snow with my hands? That question never once let me sleep an easy night. It's why I talk to the stone, Maren. A man who won't open a door to the living ends up making his conversation with the rock. And what would you tell yourself now, if you could go back and sit down beside that younger man? Ransom leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. I'd tell him that surviving all by yourself is just a slower way of disappearing. That's all it is. You hold out long enough alone, and one day there's nothing left of you worth the holding. Maren did not answer him. She stared into the fire and felt the weight of every sack she had dragged up that hillside, every purple bruise across her shoulders, every morning she had woken in the black cold, and chosen to keep moving when not one soul in the world expected her to. All of it built for one person, all of it hers by right of suffering. And now this old man was asking her to open her hard-won door to the very people who had decided on a piece of paper that she was not worth a line of ink. If I let them in, she said at last, my supplies don't last the winter. I laid in enough for one, maybe two, if I stretched. Not a dozen. I know it. So I'd be handing over my own survival to people who threw me away first. Or, Ransom opened his eyes, you'd be turning into the kind of person who doesn't throw folks away, even when she's got every reason God ever made to do it. The silence that followed was long enough for the fire to burn down toward coals before either of them broke it. Then Maren spoke, very quietly, more to herself than to him. If I let them freeze when I had the means to stop it, I'd be Silas. I'd just be one more person sitting behind a locked door deciding who's worth saving and who isn't. And I swore the night I walked out of that house that I would never become him. Ransom nodded once. He did not say that he had known she'd come to it. He did not need to. Morning came, gray and howling. Maren crawled to the mouth of the passage and pushed through the packed wall of accumulated snow to look out, and the valley had simply vanished. Where roads had run there were now smooth, white plains sculpted by the wind into drifts taller than a standing man. Fence posts had disappeared without a trace. Rooftops showed only as dark patches beneath swelling mounds, and from a full half of the chimneys, no smoke rose at all. The storm had not weakened overnight. If anything, the wind had found a second strength, driving curtains of snow across the drowned landscape, with a sound like fabric tearing slow and steady and without any intention of stopping. She pulled back inside, brushing ice from her lashes, and it was then, through the narrow gap she'd opened, that she saw the movement on the slope below. A figure, barely visible through the blowing white, struggling uphill through drifts that swallowed it to the waist. It fell every few steps. It rose slower each time, too unsteady on its feet to be a young or a strong one. Maren was moving before the thought had finished forming. She snatched up her lamp, pulled her coat tight, and shoved out through the entrance into the full teeth of it. The cold struck her face so hard her eyes slammed shut on their own and watered themselves to ice. Snow drove against her left side, packing into every fold of her clothing, finding every gap her fingers had missed. She could not see 10 feet ahead. She fought downhill through drifts that grabbed at her legs like living things, half running and half falling in the direction she had last seen the figure go down. She found Odessa Kell, face down in the snow. The old woman's mittens had frozen into solid white stones. One whole side of her coat had gone stiff as board, where the wet had soaked through and then turned to ice. Her lips had lost their color. Her eyes were shut. Maren dropped to her knees and rolled her over. Odessa, can you hear me? Look at me. The pale eyes cracked open, unfocused, drifting. But the cracked lips moved. Knew you'd gone underground, she breathed, the ghost of satisfaction in it, even now. Told you. Smarter than freezing. Maren hauled the old woman's arm across her own shoulders and stood. Odessa weighed almost nothing, and somehow that was the worst of it, the terrible lightness of a body that had already given so much of itself to cold, and to years, and to hard living that there was scarcely enough of it left to be worth carrying. You're coming with me. Don't you dare quit on me now. Getting back up the hill very nearly finished the both of them. Climb through deepening snow with a half-conscious woman draped across her back was the hardest physical thing Maren Pascoe had ever done in a life that had not spared her hard things. Twice the wind hit them broadside and tore Odessa clean out of her grip, and twice she went back, found her, lifted her, and kept climbing. Her legs burned to the bone. Her lungs tore at the frozen air. She had stopped feeling her hands entirely. The third time Odessa slipped, Maren caught her by the collar of the frozen coat and held on with a strength that came from somewhere below muscle, from the same buried place that had decided 3 months ago on a frozen hillside that she would not let this winter take one more thing from her that she had the power to keep. She found the entrance only because she had long ago memorized its position against a distinctive split boulder 20 yards downslope, and even that landmark was drowning under the snow. Then the passage swallowed them, and the wind's roar dropped to a murmur, and the murmur to silence, and the warmth reached out and touched them both like a living hand. Ransom was already on his feet. He took Odessa from her arms and carried her to the fire as though she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. He stripped the frozen mittens from her hands and began working the blood back into her white fingertips between his own scarred palms. Maren wrapped a blanket around the old woman's shoulders and fed the fire until it blazed higher than she had let it burn all winter. Sense and caution be damned. Odessa's eyes found their focus by slow degrees. They traveled the chamber, taking in the shelves, the stacked wood, the ordered rows of stores, the raised platform of the bed. Her expression climbed from confusion to recognition and then to something near awe. You, you truly prepared for this. Maren knelt beside her, chafing the old woman's forearm through the blanket. Somebody had to. The storm held them, sealed inside for 2 full days after that. It screamed against the hillside without a single pause, building its drifts higher, erasing the last evidence that a valley had ever existed below. Inside, the three of them settled into a rhythm that needed no discussing. Maren tended the fire and rationed the water. Ransom melted snow in the buckets and kept the entrance from sealing over entirely. Odessa, once her strength crept back into her, took over the food stores and calculated the rations with the sharp economy of a woman who had done famine arithmetic before and lived to teach it. They did not talk much. There was a comfort in the quiet, the particular ease of three people who had each learned, by their own hard road, that actions tell more truth than words ever manage. On the second evening, stirring a pot of potato soup over the coals, Maren watched Ransom whittle a spoon from a length of pine and hand it across to Odessa for her share, and she watched Odessa mend a torn seam in her spare blanket with a needle she kept threaded in her coat collar. And she divided the soup into three exactly equal portions without being asked and without a word about it, and she understood that these small exchanges were saying everything the three of them would never say straight out. "You know what this place puts me in mind of?" Odessa said. Her spoon paused above the bowl, the firelight softening 30 years off the lines of her face. "What's that?" "Good sense." The old woman's mouth curved. "Just plain good sense dug into a hill." Maren laughed. It came out short and surprised, the first laugh to leave her in more weeks than she could count, and it startled her nearly as much as it seemed to please Odessa. Ransom watched from his corner and said nothing, but the deep lines at the corners of his eyes shifted, which for that man was the same as a grin. On the third morning, the storm eased just enough to see beyond the entrance, and the sights stopped all three of them where they stood. The drifts had climbed to the eaves of the buried houses. The road through town had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Two barns on the eastern edge of the valley had folded flat under the accumulated weight, their timbers fanned out beneath the snow like the ribs of something that had lain down to rest. Smoke rose weakly from only a scattered handful of chimneys. Odessa stared down toward the town with her jaw set hard. They're in trouble down there. Bad trouble. Maren had known it since the first morning when she counted the cold and smokeless chimneys and made herself stop counting before the number could unmake her resolve. She had also worked out, lying awake, through the long second night, the problem that would sink any rescue before it began. No one who needed the cave knew where the cave was. She had hidden it too well, and the storm had hidden it further. A dozen freezing families could stand at the base of the hill in this whiteout and never find the seam in the rock. The knowledge of where safety lay was locked in three heads inside the mountain, and it would do the valley no good at all locked in there. She turned it over with Ransom while Odessa slept. "The Wades know where I am. Corbin's left corn at the trail marker every Thursday since October. He can lead people up from the low end." She scraped a rough map into the dust of the floor with a stick. "But he can't do it alone in this, and he doesn't know the upper slope the way you do. When the wind drops enough to move, you take the high traverse and bring in whoever's stranded east. I'll go down the direct line to the marker and light a fire in the mouth of the cave where the smoke shows against the snow. That smoke's the only sign anyone will find in this. It has to be the beacon." Ransom studied the crude map, then studied her, and something in his weathered face rearranged itself into a kind of respect he had not shown her before. "You just told the smoke to stop being your enemy and start flying." He almost smiled. "Your father teach you to think like that, or'd you come by it yourself?" "Both, I think." He started it. The winter finished it. They went out the moment the wind fell off enough to stand against. Maren built the fire up high and green, so it smoked black and thick against the white sky. A dark thumbprint smeared on the low clouds, visible from the valley floor in a way it never had been and never would be again once she no longer needed it seen. Then she plunged down the direct line toward the trail marker, breaking a path with her whole body, packing the snow behind her into something the next person could follow. She met Corbin Wade halfway up, and he was not alone. He had the boy on his back, Micah's small arms locked around his father's neck, the child bundled so thoroughly in every blanket the Wade house owned that only his eyes showed. Corbin himself looked like a man who had been fighting for 3 days and losing ground the whole time, his coat torn at the shoulder, his boots soaked black through. When he saw the beacon smoke standing against the sky above him, and then saw Maren breaking trail down toward him, he stopped in the drift and simply stared, and his weathered face did a complicated thing that held shame and relief and bone-deep exhaustion all folded together. You've been living up there this whole time. It was not quite a question. Warm and dry the whole while. She reached them and got her shoulder under Corbin's free arm, taking half his weight and the boys without being asked. The chimney give out? 2 nights back. Couldn't clear it. Tried till my hands wouldn't close. Breath came ragged. The little one's cold, Maren. He's cold and I couldn't get him warm, and I didn't know where else in this world to carry him. He's about to be the warmest he's been all winter. Move your feet. Follow my track. Don't make your own. She got them up the hill and through the passage, and she saw the exact moment the warmth reached. Micah saw the boy's shivering catch and then ease as the deep cold of the threshold gave way to the fire. She peeled the frozen outer blanket off him and wrapped him fresh in one warm near the coals, and she put a cup of water heated just past lukewarm into his small hands and made him sip it slow. Within the quarter hour, the color had climbed back into his cheeks, and he was looking around the firelit chamber with the frank astonishment of a child who had expected to be miserable and found himself instead inside the most interesting room he had ever seen. He drank the soup Odessa spooned out for him. Then he curled against a grain sack with the abrupt completeness of a boy whose body has finally been told it is allowed to rest. And he slept, safe and warm and entirely unharmed by the cold he'd been carried out of. Corbin sat beside his son and held the small hand where it had fallen loose against the blanket, and he did not say a word, because there was no word that would have carried the freight of what he was feeling. He had glanced, once, at the shelf where Maren kept the dried corn, and she had seen him recognize it, the same corn he had been leaving at the trail marker every Thursday since the first frost. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them mentioned it. Some things keep better where they are. That was the shape of it for the rest of the third day, only the 5 of them in the chamber, Maren and Ransom and Odessa and the Wades. And in the space between that first small family and the flood that would come, something shifted in how they occupied the room together. Corbin, once he had rested and eaten and satisfied himself that Micah's color was there to stay, began doing things without being asked. He restacked the firewood that had shifted in the night. He cleared the fresh snow from the passage mouth. He took the water buckets out of Ransom's hands and carried them himself, insisting the older man sit and spare his knees. He did all of it quietly, the way a man works when he has understood that labor is the only thing he owns adequate to the size of his gratitude. In the evening, with Micah asleep against his side, Corbin finally spoke to Maren of the thing that sat between them. I was in that diner. He kept his eyes on the fire. The morning you came in and warned the whole room. I sat right there at the second table, and I didn't say one word to back you. And I knew I'd been reading the sky myself for 2 weeks. I knew you had the right of it, and I let them laugh you out the door, anyhow. Why didn't you speak up? Corbin was a long time answering, because speaking up would have meant crossing Ambrose. And a man who crosses Ambrose finds his credit at that store gets tight of a sudden. His orders take a month instead of a week. His prices climb just enough that he notices but can't prove a thing. He turned his cracked hands over and looked at the palms as though the answer were written there. I chose my credit line over your good name. That's the plain and ugly truth of it, and I've had 3 days snowed in with it. You left corn at the marker every Thursday. His head came up sharp. You knew that was me. I knew. She fed a stick to the fire. It doesn't square the diner, Corbin, but it fed me the week. Ambrose leaned on the farmers, and 2 of the 3 stopped selling. So it made a difference. Not the same kind, a real one. Corbin nodded slowly and said nothing more that night. But from that hour forward, whenever Maren made a decision about the running of the cave, whether it touched the rations or the fire or the sleeping arrangements, Corbin Wade stood behind her without a flicker of hesitation, not because he owed her, though he did, because he had learned, at last, what his silence had cost. and he had decided he was finished paying that particular price for anyone. On the fourth morning, the others began to come, following the packed trails and the black flag of smoke. A woman and her two half-grown daughters from the far east side, the girls tired and cold, but walking on their own, quickly wrapped and fed, and set near the warmth to recover. A young married couple from one of the outlying homesteads, half frozen, carrying nothing at all but each other. By noon, the chamber held 9. By the failing light of that afternoon, it held 11, arranged in overlapping islands of shared blankets around a fire. Maren no longer bothered to keep small, because concealment had stopped being the point of anything. Cade Marsh came through the passage just before dark, the frost caked so thick in his beard it looked like a white mask fitted over the lower half of his face. He straightened up into the firelight and stopped dead, and he stared at the interior of the cave the way a man stares at a thing he has spent his whole life fundamentally misunderstanding. The shelves running the length of the walls, stacked with jars and grain sacks and potatoes. The firewood dry and ready in its rows. The warm, steady air holding its own against a storm that was still tearing the valley to pieces on the other side of the rock. You built all of this. His big voice had gone strange and small. By yourself. I did. I laughed at you. He pulled the frozen mittens from his hands slowly, his eyes still moving over the chamber, cataloging every proof of his own wrongness. For hauling supplies up this hill, I stood in the road, and I laughed. You did. Yeah. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, it plainly cost him something to push the words out. Reckon I was the fool of the two of us. Not you. He had not come alone. Cade had his little sister with him, 6-year-old Posey, and the child was cold clear through, shivering inside the coat he'd wrapped her in, her nose and cheeks gone red with the chill, but her eyes bright and her breathing easy. Maren took her from Cade's arms and felt the tremor running through the small body, and she did not hesitate. Right by the fire, close as she'll go, without touching the coals. Ransom the honey. She stripped the wet outer layer from the girl and swaddled her in the warmest blanket in the cave, one that had been hanging near the fire an hour and held the heat of it. She spooned honey into a cup of water warmed to just past blood heat and held it to the child's lips. Small sips, sweetheart. Not too fast. There's no hurry now. You're inside. You're safe, and the cold can't follow you in here. Odessa took over with the certainty of a woman who had warmed cold children through more hard seasons than most doctors ever saw, and between the two of them they coaxed the chill out of Posey Marsh by inches. They kept her close to the warmth. They kept the warm water going into her, sip by patient sip. They rubbed the feeling back into her small hands. Cade sat pressed against the stone at his sister's side, his enormous hands, the hands that could bend cold iron across an anvil, resting light as he could make them on the girl's hair, and the loud, certain blacksmith did not say a single word. He only watched his sister come back to herself by degrees, and when at last she stopped shivering and burrowed sleepily into the warm blanket and asked him in a small, clear voice whether they could have some of that soup, the sound that came out of Cade Marsh was half a laugh and half something else entirely, and he pulled her against his chest and held her there and breathed. She was warm within the hour, warm and drowsy and safe, tucked between her brother and a sack of grain, her cheeks their proper color again, her small hand curled around Odessa's finger. Whatever the storm had meant to do to the child, the cave and the fire and the honey and 2 pairs of stubborn hands had gotten to her first. By the 5th day, nearly a dozen souls sheltered inside the mountain. Families shared blankets in the firelight. The children slept against the grain sacks in a row like cordwood, warm and fed and watched over. Snowmelt simmered in a kettle slung over the coals, and the smell of wood smoke and wet wool and potato soup, filled the chamber and made it, against all reason, feel less like a refuge and more like a home. Lavinia Reed had arrived on the 4th day, wet through and shaking, and she had not said one word about children or experience, or the natural order of who ought to know better. She simply sat where Maren pointed her to sit, and accepted the bowl Maren put into her hands, and watched a 17-year-old girl govern a cave full of frightened grown adults with the quiet competence of someone who had been preparing for exactly this her whole life, without ever knowing it. Then Emery Stagg came in out of the storm with his son, and the peace of the place changed. Emery was 40, a broad-chested farmer with hands like the flat of a shovel and a voice that filled any room whether the room wanted filling or not. Boy Wesley, 16, thin and watchful, came in behind him carrying a bundle of sodden blankets. From the moment he had thought enough to speak, Emery began to complain about the cold and the cramped quarters and the poor fare, and he paced the length of the chamber like a penned bull, muttering about the livestock he'd left and the indignity of being reduced to sheltering in a hole in the ground beside people he'd not ordinarily share a fence line with. That night, when Maren divided the evening rations into equal portions, Emery heaved himself to his feet. "I'm twice the size of half the folk crammed in here." He jabbed a thick finger at the modest portion in his hand. "I need more than a child's share to keep my engine running." Equal portions. Maren did not look up from the ladle. No exceptions in this cave for anyone. "And who handed you the right to make the rules? This isn't your house, girl. It's a crack and a rock." Cade was on his feet before Maren could answer, stepping into the space between Emery and the fire, his bulk suddenly a wall. She built this place with her own two hands, while the rest of us were laughing at her for it. She stocked every shelf you're staring at. She's the whole and entire reason you and your boy aren't shut up cold in your own farmhouse tonight. His jaw worked. "You want to argue portions, Emery? You can argue them out in the weather." Ransom's voice came low, and even from the shadows against the back wall, and somehow it carried further than Cade's had. "I have watched grown men come to blows over half a loaf of bread in a hard winter. Seen it with my own eyes, more than the once." The fire popped into the silence he left. Equal shares is the only law that keeps a shelter from turning on itself. Not because it's kind, because it's the only rule nobody can twist into a reason to take from the person next to him. The chamber had gone dead quiet. The firelight moved across a dozen faces and through their shadows tall and wavering up the stone, making everyone in the cave look older and more fragile than they were. Emery turned his head, hunting the room for one face that would take his side. Not one would meet his eyes. Then his own son spoke. "Pa, stop." Wesley's voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "She's right, and you know she's right. Sit down." Emery looked at the boy as though he'd been struck across the face. Wesley did not look away, did not soften it, did not offer his father any road back to his dignity. For a long moment, the two of them stood locked, father and son, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with soup and everything to do with what a boy sees. The first time he watches his father choose selfishness in a crowded room and finds it small. It was the kind of moment that cannot be taken back once it has happened. Wesley would carry it the rest of his life. So would Emery, and both of them knew it, standing there in the firelight, which was its own kind of wound. Emery sat down. He took his equal portion without another word. But the anger did not leave his eyes, and it did not leave the cave with the silence that followed. It only banked itself like a fire, waiting for someone to feed it. Later, when the others had gone to sleep, Wesley crossed the chamber to where Maren was banking the coals for the night. "I'm sorry. About my father. You don't have to carry someone else's apology. I know it." He crouched beside her, watching the coals settle. But somebody in that room needed to say the words, and it wasn't going to be him. He went back to his blanket and lay down beside it, and Maren watched him a moment. This boy, nearly her own age, who had just chosen the truth over his own blood in front of a cave full of witnesses. She understood the cost of what he'd done better than he could know, because she had paid a version of it herself, the night she chose survival over belonging and walked out of Silas Renner's kitchen into the snow. On the sixth night there came a sound at the entrance, soft, barely rising above the wind's steady moan. Maren crawled to the passage and pushed the fresh snow aside and found Della Thorne crouched in the gap, shaking so hard she could not hold herself upright, her hair matted with ice, small cloth sack clutched against her chest with both arms. "Della." Maren pulled her through and into the warmth. The girl's teeth were chattering too violently for speech. Maren brought her to the fire and wrapped a blanket around her and waited until the worst of the shaking had passed before she asked anything at all. "I took it from the stockroom." Della's voice came in broken pieces. She opened the sack with fingers that would barely obey her. flour, dried corn, a double handful of salt pork. It isn't much. It's what I could carry without him hearing the door. She swallowed hard. He saw me take it, Maren. He stood in the stockroom doorway, and he watched me fill the sack, and he told me that if I walked out that door with it, I was no daughter of his. Maren looked at the girl she had known, since they were both small enough, to steal apples from the orchard behind the leaning church. Then why did you come? Della's eyes filled and spilled over, the tears freezing along her lashes before they could fall. Because he's got the whole stockroom locked. 200 pounds of flour behind that partition, salt pork enough to feed the valley, 40 jars of preserves, and he's parceling it out only to the families he chooses. The Coles, the Harnets, people who owe him money or owe him favors, people who will remember the debt come spring. She dragged the back of her shaking hand across her face. I couldn't sit in that warm store one more hour and watch my father decide who in this valley is allowed to eat, while good people are freezing in the dark not half a mile off. I couldn't do it, so I stopped doing it. Maren drew her close and held her, and the two of them sat there in the firelight, two girls thrown out by their own families, one for the crime of being surplus, and one for the crime of keeping a conscience, in a cave that had become the only honest shelter left standing in a valley full of locked doors. By the seventh day, the stores had thinned to a wall Maren could see coming. She moved along the shelves in the deep of the night, with her lamp held low while the others slept, touching each sack and each jar the way another person might count money. And the count was grim. Flour, less than 15 pounds. Potatoes, 20, and some of them going soft at the eyes. Salt pork, 3 pieces. Enough for one more pot if she stretched it thin with snowmelt. The preserves were gone entirely, eaten the fourth day when the youngest of the newcomers had come in cold and near tears, and she'd had nothing else sweet enough to turn a hard evening into sleep. She thought about what Silas would say if he could see her now. He would say the numbers never lie. He would say she had proven his whole point for him, run herself empty in exactly the manner he had predicted, only faster, because she had chosen to feed a dozen mouths instead of the one his arithmetic had allotted. And on the narrow question of the numbers, he would be right. But she had learned a thing this winter that Silas Renner would go to his grave never understanding. The sound of a small girl asking for soup in a clear, untroubled voice does not fit into a column. The look on Corbin Wade's face when his boy fell asleep, warm and safe, does not subtract from anything. The weight of Odessa's frozen hand in hers on that killing slope cannot be entered in any ledger ever made. There were things that mattered more than the numbers, and every one of them was in this cave, breathing, because she had chosen wrong according to the arithmetic and right according to something the arithmetic had never once been able to measure. She told only Ransom the true state of the stores. He heard her out, then said the things she had already known and had needed to hear in another voice regardless. If this storm doesn't break by the 9th day, we go out into it anyway. All of us together, breaking trail for the low end. His eyes held hers, steady as the stone around them. A slim chance in the open beats a sure thing in here with empty shelves. But it won't come to that. This kind blows itself out. I've felt the edge of it go soft the last 2 hours. Listen. She listened. And beneath the wind, which had indeed lost the worst of its edge, she heard something else. A deep, intermittent groaning that rolled up out of the far mountains, as though the ranges themselves had grown weary of holding so much weight and had begun, very slowly, to shift beneath it. Della came and sat beside her at the entrance a while later, and for a long stretch neither of them spoke. Then Della asked it low, "Are you afraid?" "Yes." "Of the storm?" Maren shook her head slowly. "I'm afraid that when this is over, it all just slides back to how it was. They'll thank me, some of them, and then they'll forget, the way people always forget the thing that frightened them, once the fright is gone. And I'll be the girl who got thrown out, the surplus, right back where I started, only colder for having hoped. That won't happen." Della's voice was certain in a way Maren had not heard from her before. There are some things people don't get to forget, no matter how badly they'd like to. This is one of them. They'll look up at this hill every winter for the rest of their lives, and they'll remember what the girl they threw away built while they were laughing. Della went back inside to sleep. Maren stayed. After a while, Ransom came and lowered himself into the place Della had left, and he did not look at her, only out at the storm and the dark and the thinning snow. And when he spoke, his voice was different again, softer and older, as though the words had been waiting a very long time for the right night to be said. You've got one thing wrong. Only one. The corner of his mouth moved. You said you're afraid of being forgotten. But that's not the whole of it, is it? You're just as afraid of being remembered. Because being remembered means you belong to this place now. It means these people and this valley are a part of you, whether you gave them leave to be or not. And you haven't let yourself belong anywhere since the day they carried your father up out of that mine. Maren did not answer because she could not. Ransom Teal, the man who had lived alone so long he'd started talking to the stone, had reached past every wall she had built this winter and set his weathered hand directly on the wound underneath all the others. Not the fear of the cold, not even the fear of dying. The fear that opening herself to a place and to people again meant handing them the power to break her, the way the mine had broken her father into pieces small enough to bury, the way the kitchen table had broken her mother into a silence with no bottom to it. Belonging was the most dangerous thing a person could do. More dangerous than any blizzard, because you could lay in wood and food against a blizzard, and there was no stocking a shelf against the moment someone you had let all the way in decided you were not enough to keep. The tears came and froze on her cheeks before they reached her jaw, and Ransom did not reach to comfort her. He only sat beside her in the cold, dark mouth of the cave, two people who understood loneliness in their bones, and together they waited for the storm to break or the morning to come, whichever the mountains decided to send them first. The storm broke on the 8th morning, and it broke the way a fever breaks, not with any grand collapse, but with a slow surrender that a person could miss if she were not watching for it. There was no sudden clearing of the sky. No dramatic silence dropped over the valley like a curtain. The wind simply grew tired. It lost its edge hour by hour through the last of the night, falling from a sustained howl to a low moan to something that was almost like breathing, and by the time the first thin gray light found the mouth of the cave, the world beyond the passage had gone still for the first time in a week. Maren was already awake. She had slept in snatches through the final night, never more than an hour at a stretch, rising each time to feed the fire and touch the shelves and listen for whatever the mountains would decide to send. When the stillness came, it was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a sound she had not heard since the night she walked out of Silas Renner's kitchen. She crawled to the entrance, pushed aside the drift that had packed the passage overnight, and looked out on a valley that had been remade. Every familiar shape was gone, buried or bent past knowing. Where the road through Sable Creek had run there was now a smooth white plain, broken only by the dark angles of rooftops that surfaced through the snow, like the spines of something vast asleep beneath it. The fence lines had vanished as though they had never been. The leaning steeple of the church, its north face torn open to the weather, stood crooked against a sky the color of cold iron. Two barns on the eastern rim had collapsed entirely, their timbers fanned out beneath the weight. From a scattered few chimneys, thin threads of smoke climbed straight up into the windless air. Too many others, nothing rose at all. Behind her, the chamber was waking. Blankets shifted. A low murmur of voices rose as the sheltered families understood, one by one, that the roaring that had filled their ears for 8 days had finally stopped. Then a small voice cut clear across all of it. "Can we go out now?" Micah Wade was already on his feet, peering toward the pale light at the passage mouth with the desperate hope of a boy who had spent a week inside a mountain. Corbin caught his son gently by the shoulder. "In a minute, let's be sure it's done." The boy had already squeezed past Maren and stumbled out into the open, sinking to his waist in the fresh drift, pushing himself forward 2 more floundering steps before he tipped his head back to the white sky and laughed. The sound of it carried across the buried valley with a startling clarity, a child's laughter ringing off the snowfields and the drowned rooftops in the dead still air, and it did something to every grown person crowded in the mouth of that cave. Cade Marsh closed his eyes. Lavinia Reed pressed a hand over her mouth. Odessa stood very still and let the sound wash over her like the first warmth of a spring she had not been sure she would live to see. Even Emery Stagg, who had spoken to almost no one since the night his own son corrected him, lifted his head and looked toward the boy with an expression that was not quite softness, but was no longer stone. Carried Posey out into the light after him, and the girl squinted against the brightness, with her cheeks flushed pink from the fire. And she pointed at the endless white and said something to her brother that no one else could catch, and Cade nodded and held her a little tighter than the moment strictly called for. Ransom stood apart from the rest at the back of the group, watching the valley below with a face that gave away nothing. Maren looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing left to say between them that the long, dark hours at the cave mouth had not already said, so neither of them said anything at all. Wesley Stagg came to stand beside Maren without being asked, and when his father pushed past them both and started down the slope toward town without a word to anyone, Wesley did not follow. He stayed where he was, planted next to the girl his father had tried to bully over a plate of food, and watched Emery's broad back descend through the snow. It was a small thing, staying. But Maren had learned this winter that the smallest acts are sometimes the loudest thing a person ever says. The walk down took the better part of an hour. Snow lay chest-deep in the drifts and never less than knee-deep even in the shallows, so they moved in a single file. Maren and Cade breaking trail at the front, the other stepping into the packed holes they left behind. Ransom brought up the rear, silent and watchful. Odessa walked slowly, but without complaint, one thin hand resting on Corbin's forearm for balance. Micah stomped along on his own 2 feet, spending energy he had stored up for a week, determined to make up every minute of it. Sable Creek, when they reached the place where the main road had been, looked like a settlement that had been struck by a fist and then buried where it fell. Windows had blown in on 3 houses. The roof of the feedlot had caved. A wagon lay overturned against the side of the blacksmith's shop, flung there by a wind strong enough to throw it. People were already out digging, their movements slow and stunned, the mechanical labor of survivors who have not yet grasped the full size of the thing they survived. 2 families on the south end had been shut inside their own homes for 6 days, unable to force their doors against the packed weight of the snow, and neighbors were shoveling them free as Maren's group came down out of the hills. Coals emerged blinking and wrung out, their children pale but whole and walking, their stove gone cold days before. They had burned their kitchen chairs on the 3rd night to keep the little ones warm, and the mother of them carried her youngest on her hip and would not set the child down, even when someone brought her a cup of hot water, as though letting go for one moment might allow the storm to reach back in and take what it had failed to take the first time. But it was the general store that pulled every eye in the churned snow of the road. Ambrose Thorne's building stood nearly untouched. Its walls had been braced with extra timber that no one had thought to question when the bracing went up in the last mild weeks of autumn. Its roof had held clean against a weight that had folded barns flat. Its windows were shuttered and sealed tight, the shutters themselves reinforced from within. While every other structure in Sable Creek had lost something to the storm, a roof, a window, a wall, a life's worth of stores, the general store looked as though it had been built for precisely this storm and no other. Because it had. Maren had watched him build it. She had stood in the blue dark behind that store weeks ago with 2 empty buckets in her hands and watched Ambrose Thorne drive fresh nails into fresh boards, sealing a private survival inside the public one. And now the whole valley could see the fruit of that secret labor standing whole and warm above the wreckage of everything around it. Cade Marsh walked toward the store with a look on his face that Maren had not seen there before. Not the loud certainty and not the humbled shame, but something colder and more deliberate than either. He stopped in the trampled snow before the barred door and put his blacksmith's voice to its proper use for the first time all winter. Ambrose, open this door. Nothing answered him but the drip of melt from an eave. Behind Cade, the others gathered in the snow, and more of the town drifted toward the confrontation from every direction, drawn across the drifts by the sound of a name spoken like a charge. Within 10 minutes, nearly half of Sable Creek stood clustered before the store in the cold morning air, the diggers and the dugout, the families who had received a quiet Thursday sack and the families who had received nothing at all. Ambrose, Cade's voice climbed. Open it, or I open it for you. I bend harder things than that lock before breakfast. The bar lifted from within, the door swung inward. Ambrose Thorne stood in the opening, and he was thinner than Maren remembered from 3 weeks past, his face drawn, his pressed shirt hanging loose at the collar, his pale eyes moving across the gathered crowd and doing the only thing they had ever known how to do, which was to calculate. He looked like a man who had been expecting this exact morning for 8 days and dreading its arrival in equal measure. You locked this store. Cade's words carried, flat and hard in the still air, every soul in the crowd hearing each one. You sat inside it with your 200 pounds of flour and your salt pork and your 40 jars of preserves, and you barred the door while folks 2 doors down burned their furniture to keep their children warm. I protected my inventory. Ambrose's voice was steady, though his hands at his sides were not. Every man in this valley has the right to protect what belongs to him. A right. Cade turned the word over like something gone rotten in his mouth. I offered supplies. Ambrose lifted his chin, hunting for the high ground he had always been able to find before. Several families received provisions from me through the worst of it. Ask the Coles. Ask the Harnets. The families you chose. Corb Binwade said it from the back of the crowd. And heads turned because Corbin Wade did not raise his voice, had perhaps never raised it in public in his life. He pushed forward through the press until he stood in the open space between the crowd and the door, his son close behind him, and Maren realized she was watching the quiet widower, angry for the first time since she had known him. Transformed him. The gentle man with the cracked hands and the tired kindness became something forged and edged, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. You chose who ate by who owed you. The Coles are into you for a plow they'll be paying off till they're old. The Harnets signed a note against their south field last spring. You fed your debtors and you called it charity. Corbin's jaw was tight. My boy was cold on my back while I carried him up a mountain to a cave, because the only door in this valley with food behind it was the one you'd barred against him. He is 7 years old, and you sat warm behind that lumber and let me carry him past your window. The crowd shifted. Maren watched the faces change, watched the expression move through them like wind crossing a wheat field. And it was not anger, or not only anger. It was recognition. The recognition of a thing they had all known for years, and had each, for their own private reasons of debt and dependence, and the plain fear of the only store within 30 miles, agreed among themselves not to see. Maren stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. In the silence of that crowd, she had no need to. You refused to sell to me 3 months ago. She kept her eyes level on Ambrose, and the whole valley went quiet to hear it. You stood behind that counter, and you told me I was hoarding in a way that harmed the community. Those were your words. Hoarding. Harm to the community. She let it hang there in the cold. Then, you locked your store against the worst storm this valley has ever seen, and you parceled out food to the people who served you, and you left the rest to fend in the dark. So, I'll ask you the only question that matters. In front of everyone you tried to keep it from. Hoarding, Ambrose. Which one of us harmed this community? The silence that followed was total. Somewhere down the road, a chunk of snow slid off a roof and struck the drift below with a soft collapse, and no one turned to look. Ambrose's eyes went to Maren, then swept the crowd, then came back to her, and his mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Behind him, in the dim interior of the store, the shelves stood visible through the open door, orderly and intact, holding provisions enough to have carried half the valley through the storm with room to spare. Everyone could see them now. That was the thing no reinforced shutter could keep out. Everyone could see exactly how much had been behind that barred door the whole time they went without. Corbin turned from Ambrose to face the crowd. I'm calling on the council to strip Ambrose Thorne of his seat overseeing winter supply. Here now. In front of the people it was supposed to protect. His voice did not waver. Every soul in favor, raise your hand and let him count you. Lavinia Reed's hand went up first. The minister's wife who had turned Maren away with a cup of coffee and a locked door, and there was something in the way she lifted it that looked like penance. Then Cade's hand. Then, one after another, across the gathered crowd, the hands rose. The Coles, who had burned their chairs to the frames, raised their hands even though Ambrose had fed them, because they had seen at last what the feeding had cost their neighbors. The families who had received nothing raised theirs without hesitation. And at the very back of the crowd, his jaw set hard, his eyes fixed on the churned snow at his feet, Emery Stagg raised his hand. Wesley, standing at Maren's side, raised his the same instant, and father and son saw each other across the crowd with their arms lifted for the same cause. And something passed between them that was not forgiveness, but might one day become the ground forgiveness could grow in. Every hand was a nail driven into the same board. Maren watched Ambrose count them with those calculating eyes, and she understood that she was witnessing the end of more than a man's seat on a council. She was watching a man discover that the power he had spent a lifetime building, the power that ran entirely through what people needed and could get nowhere else, could be undone in a single frozen morning. The moment those same people decided, together, that they no longer needed him in order to survive. Ambrose's gaze traveled the crowd one final time, and it found his daughter. Della stood near Maren, not behind her, beside her. She met her father's eyes across the snow with an expression that held grief and resolve twisted together too tightly to separate. Ambrose looked at the girl he had cast out of his house 6 nights before for the crime of feeding the hungry, and for a moment the calculation drained entirely out of his face and left something behind it that was almost human and entirely alone. Then he stepped backward into the store and closed the door. Not with a slam. Just a quiet click, the sound of a man retreating into the only space in the world, still willing to hold him. Caden Corbin opened the store an hour later, the bar lifted for good this time, and they gave out the supplies to every family in the valley in equal measure. No preference, no ledger, no debt weighed against a family supper. Maren organized the distribution the way she had organized the cave, measuring each portion, tracking what left the shelves, ensuring that no family carried away 1 ounce, more or less than any other. The skill she had ground into herself, keeping a dozen people alive inside a mountain, translated whole and unbroken to the work of keeping a town alive above the ground. And standing at her elbow, helping her count sacks and weigh flour, was Della Thorne, working in her father's store for the first time in her life, not as his daughter, but as something and someone else entirely. A girl who had chosen which side of a locked door she meant to stand on and had walked through the storm to prove it. Ransom Teal did not come to the store. When Maren looked for him in the crowd, he was already gone, and she understood without being told that he had slipped away up the hill. The moment the outcome was no longer in doubt. The way a man leaves a room, once he is certain the fire he lit will burn on its own. She climbed back to the cave near dusk, bone-tired in a way that had nothing left of fear in it, and she found his corner of the chamber empty. His blanket was folded neatly on the stone floor, squared at the corners the way a soldier might leave a bunk. The deerskin coat was gone. The only trace of him was the small, short-handled hatchet, the one he had left at the cave mouth in the first week without a word, set now on the shelf beside the fire pit, and laid across it a scrap of paper torn from something, marked in a cramped and laboring hand that plainly did not hold a pencil often. 5 words. Cave is yours now. Paid. Maren read it twice. Then she folded it once along its center and put it into the pocket of her coat, where it settled against the small leather pouch that held the lock of her father's hair. 2 men who had shaped the whole course of her life. One who had shaped it by dying in the dark, and one who had shaped it by choosing, at last, to let go into the light. She carried the note down to Odessa the following afternoon. The old woman read it, folded a long faxel in the same crease Maren had made, and pressed it into her hands. He didn't leave because he stopped caring. Odessa's pale eyes were steady. He left because he's finished. 30 years, he hauled that question up and down these mountains, whether he should have opened his door that first winter. You answered it for him, not with any words. You answered it by digging the snow away from your own door with your bare hands while he watched. Will I see him again? Odessa's mouth curved into a small and knowing thing that was not quite a smile. You'll see his boot prints in the frost every winter of your life. That's how a man like that says good morning. It was enough. Some people speak through their presence, and some through their absence, and Maren had learned this hard winter to read both. Ransom Teal had taught her how to keep a fire so the stone would hold its warmth, and then he had taught her something a great deal harder to master, which was how to let a person leave without it, meaning they had abandoned you. The difference between leaving and abandoning, she understood now, was the same as the difference between an open door and a locked one. Ransom had walked out through a door that stood open. Silas had bolted one shut behind her. The distinction had cost her 3 weeks of freezing to learn, and she would never again mistake the one for the other as long as she lived. On a gray afternoon 2 weeks after the storm, with the drifts finally slumping into heavy heaps and the first black patches of earth showing through on the south-facing slopes, Maren walked down the hill toward the house she had been thrown out of. Cade Marsh came with her, hauling a sled loaded with flour and potatoes and preserves from the store's fairly distributed shelves. Having volunteered for the work before she could ask, and having refused, in his newly humbled way, to be talked out of it. The path to the door of Silas Renner's house had been cleared, but poorly, a narrow trench chopped through the drift by a man with barely enough strength left in him to keep his own stove fed. Maren stood before the door a full minute before she raised her hand to it. She listened to her own breathing and to the steady drip of melt from the eaves where the weak afternoon sun had begun its slow work, and she did not know what she meant to say. She only knew, with a certainty that had no words attached to it, that she had to come. Silas opened the door. Slowly. He had aged a decade in the 3 weeks since she had seen him. The lines around his mouth had cut deeper, the hollows beneath his eyes had darkened, and he had lost flesh he could not spare, his shirt hanging off his shoulders as though borrowed from a larger man. Behind him the kitchen was dim, the stove burning low, the whole house smelling of boiled turnips and cold ash, and the particular staleness of a place where no window has been opened in far too long. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Silas's gaze moved past her to the loaded sled, and then to Cade, standing beside it with his hat in his hands, and something worked behind the older man's tired face that she could not name. "You came back," he said it low, as though he were afraid the words might break something. Maren looked past him into the kitchen. The table still stood where it had always stood. She could see the surface of it, the very grain of the wood where he had laid down his sheet of paper 3 months ago, the columns of numbers, the single line of ink drawn through her name. She looked at that table and waited to feel the old thing rise up in her, the anger or the triumph she had half expected to enjoy. Neither came. What came instead was a strange and level clarity, the kind that exists only on the far side of survival, when a person has proven a thing so completely to herself that the old hunger to have it acknowledged by anyone else has simply burned away to nothing. "No," she said. "I came to see whether my mother needs supplies." Silas did not step aside from the doorway. She could watch the calculation working in him, the same machine that had once reduced her to a crossed-out line, laboring now to understand how the girl he had subtracted from his household in the name of scarcity had come back up his cleared path, hauling more provisions than he had managed to lay in for the whole winter. "I'm not angry with you, Silas." The words surprised her as she said them, because she found they were true. "You were right, that there wasn't enough in this house for 4 people to reach the thaw. Your figures were sound, but you were wrong about one thing in them, the only thing that mattered. You looked at me and you saw a burden the numbers couldn't carry. I wasn't one." Silas's eyes went to the sacks on the sled, and his mouth worked a moment before he found anything to put in it. "I didn't think you'd—" He stopped, started again, and the word came out of him like a splinter pulled from deep under the skin. "Survive. I didn't think you'd survive out there, Maren, let alone come back the strongest thing in this valley." It was not an apology. Silas Renner was not a man built to shape an apology, and she knew it, and she had stopped expecting one somewhere in the second week of the storm. But it was an admission, and for a man who had lived his entire life by the gospel of certainty and the sacrament of the balanced column, admitting that his numbers had been wrong was very likely the hardest sentence he had ever forced past his own teeth. Maren accepted it for exactly what it was. She had learned over the long course of this winter that people give what they are able to give, no more and no less, and that expecting more than a person has in them to offer is only a slower way of poisoning yourself with bitterness. Odessa had given her mending and mercy and hard, useful truth. Ransom had given her silence and a hatchet and a door left open. Corbin had given her corn at a trail marker, and in the end his voice raised in a crowd. Silas gave her 3 words of grudging recognition, and each gift had been shaped entirely by the hand that offered it, and Maren was finished being bitter about the shape of any of them. Then Ruth appeared behind her husband in the dim of the kitchen. She looked smaller than Maren remembered, thinner, her hair uncombed, her eyes already wet at the rims. But this time, she did not fix her gaze on the floorboards. She looked directly at her daughter, straight and unflinching, and when she spoke, her voice held a steadiness that Maren had not heard from her in years. The night you left. Ruth's hands were folded before her, but they did not twist at her skirt this time. I stood at that window, and I watched you walk down the road until the dark took you, and I couldn't make out your shape anymore. Then I came back to this kitchen. She drew a breath that shook only a little. I took Silas's paper off that table, and I put it in the stove, and I burned it. I watched it curl up and go to ash before I let myself go to bed. Silas turned to look at his wife. This, plainly, he had not known. Some part of the arithmetic had gone missing from his ledger, and he was only now discovering the gap. Ruth met his eyes without flinching from them. I burned it because I could not stand to see my daughter's name crossed out on my own table every morning of the winter. It was the only answer I had the strength left in me to give, but I gave it. The kitchen was silent. Maren looked at her mother and understood something at last that she had carried wrong for 3 long weeks. She had believed, walking out into the snow, that Ruth's silence at the table had been consent, an empty woman agreeing by default to her daughter's banishment. She saw now that it had been nothing of the kind. Ruth had not been empty that night. She had been shattered, which is a different thing entirely, because empty things hold nothing, and broken things still hold the shape of what they used to be, still have edges, still cut. Her mother's silence in that kitchen had not been agreement. It had been the sound of a woman who had spent every last reserve of strength she possessed and could not produce one more syllable of open resistance in front of the man she now depended on to eat. But she had resisted in the only way still left to her after the door closed. She had destroyed the document that erased her child. It was a small act, a single sheet of paper burned in a cold stove while a girl walked away into the snow. But Maren had learned this winter that the smallest acts are sometimes the loudest declaration a person is capable of making. Maren reached out and took her mother's hand. Ruth gripped back with a force that surprised them both, the grip of a woman who had been holding something in for 3 weeks and could finally let a little of it go. I know, Maren said. 2 words. Not forgiveness, not the whole of it, not yet. But a bridge, narrow and fragile, laid across the space between them with the understanding shared by both of them that a bridge is built from both banks at once, and that this one would take more than a single afternoon to finish. She left the supplies on the table where the paper had once lain, and she did not stay for a supper she was not ready to eat under that roof. At the edge of the porch, she turned back once and saw her mother standing in the doorway watching her go, and Ruth's back was straight, and her chin was up, and she did not look down at the floor. Beside her, Silas Renner stood in his own kitchen and stared at the empty tabletop where his sheet of paper had been and was no longer, and he said nothing at all, because there was nothing left for him to say that the winter had not already said for him, louder and more completely than any man's arithmetic ever could. In the weeks that followed the thaw, the work of digging out consumed all of Sable Creek. Men cleared paths between the houses and shoveled the blocked chimneys free and hauled fallen timber off the barns that could still be saved. Women redistributed blankets and winter clothing among the families who had lost the most. The church, its torn north wall gaping to the sky, was sealed over temporarily with canvas and salvaged board, while the Reverend was still on the road home. Talk in the diner returned by degrees to practical things, the wood supply and the feed for the livestock that had come through. and the question of how to get a message north to the county seat for whatever help might be had. But the talk kept circling back, no matter where it started, to the same subject. The cave on the hill, the girl who had known the storm was coming, the shelves she had stocked while the whole valley laughed. Even the men who had laughed loudest spoke of her differently now, not merely with respect, but with the particular discomfort of people who have understood that their own survival hung entirely on someone they had dismissed, and that this fact could never afterward be undone or explained away or made smaller than it was. It sat down with them at their meals. It followed them to their beds. It greeted them each morning when they opened their doors, onto the slumping gray drifts, and remembered all over again who had kept the valley breathing when their own careful preparations had failed them cold. Reverend Absalom Reed returned home 2 days after the storm ended, having fought his way back through the passes the moment they were passable, and he spent his first night in the valley on his knees in the wreckage of his own church. In the mornings that followed, he gave himself over to the building of a thing he had never thought the settlement needed. The council, reduced now to honest men with Ambrose stripped from it, voted to establish a community supply reserve, stored in the dry stone basement of the church, maintained the year around and open to any family in the valley, regardless of means or standing or debt. The Reverend oversaw the raising of the shelves himself. Lavinia stood beside him and hammered nails, and said nothing about a bench or a single night's shelter, or a girl she had turned away with reasonable words and a locked door. She did not need to say it. Everyone building those shelves knew exactly whose winter had taught them the need for them. Maren did not move down into the town. Odessa offered her the second room of the widow's cottage. Corbin offered her a place at the Wade table for as long as she wanted it. Lavinia, her voice gone humble in a way it had never been before, said the parsonage had room and would be glad of her. Each offer was genuine, and each one she declined gently because the cave was hers. She had found it with her own stubbornness, hauled it into shape with her own bruised shoulders, defended it with her own judgment against a valley that had thought her a fool. It was the first thing in her life that belonged to her completely, not granted by a parent, not rented from a landlord, not held on the sufferance of another person's arithmetic. She had carried a sack of potatoes up a frozen hillside when not one soul believed she would live to eat them, and the cave had answered her by keeping her alive, and that was a debt that ran in both directions, and Maren meant to honor her half of it. She turned 18, somewhere in the middle of the blizzard. She was not certain of the exact day. She had stopped counting the days after the fifth stranger came through the passage, and by the time the storm had blown itself out and she thought to reckon it up, her birthday had already passed, somewhere in the noise and the cold and the soup and the firelight, without anyone in the world marking it, herself included. It did not trouble her. Birthdays were only another kind of counting, and she had learned this winter that the changes that truly remake a life do not arrive on any schedule a person can keep on a wall. Della Thorne did not go back to her father's house. She stayed on in the cave with Maren through the deepest of the lingering cold, sleeping on the raised platform, learning to read the fire, sharing the cooking over the coals. They did not speak much of Ambrose. There was no need to, and some subjects keep their weight better in silence. But late on certain nights, when the fire had burned down low and the chamber had gone quiet around them, Maren would catch Della staring at the entrance, and she knew the girl was thinking of her father, alone now behind his reinforced walls, surrounded by all the supplies he had hoarded, and none of the people he had spent them to control, and wondering whether the loneliness he had built for himself was a punishment or a choice, or, as it so often turned out to be, both at once. Then one morning near the end of February, with the icicles along the cave mouth dripping steadily in the strengthening sun, Della told Maren she was going back. He's sick. She sat near the fire with her knees drawn up, watching the low flames. I heard it from the Harnett girl at the store. A cough that won't let go of him. He hasn't been out in a week, and there's not a soul in that valley checking on him. Not one. Maren did not try to talk her out of it. Will he even let you in? I don't know. Della rose and brushed the ash from her skirt. But somebody has to go. She looked at Maren. and there was no irony anywhere in her face. Though they both heard the echo of it plainly, both recognized the words that Maren had said to Ransom in the teeth of the storm, the night she dragged Odessa up the hill. The phrase had grown into something larger than itself over the course of the winter. It had become a kind of compass in the mouths of the people who had sheltered in that cave, a needle that swung always toward the hard thing, the necessary thing, the thing that no one else was willing to do, and someone, therefore, had to. Della walked down the hill that morning toward the general store. Maren watched her go from the cave mouth until the small figure was lost among the buildings, and she thought about the strange mathematics of mercy, how it never once balanced the way Silas's columns balanced, how the people who deserved it least so often turned out to be the ones who needed it most, how giving it away never subtracted a thing from the one who gave, but somehow always added something that could not be weighed or named or entered in any ledger. She learned later how it had gone. Della had knocked at the store's back door, and Ambrose had opened it after a long delay, coughing, his face gone gray with illness, and with something else beneath the illness, the particular shade of a man who has been left alone with his own choices long enough to finally see the true shape of them. Della had walked past him into the store without waiting to be asked. She had put water on to heat and swept the floor and made a broth from the salt pork and fed it to him a spoonful at a time without a word of reproach passing between them. And when Ambrose finally asked her, his voice rough and small and diminished, why in the world she had come back to a man who had disowned her at his own door, Della had answered him with 4 words and no explanation attached. Because somebody had to. She did not say more than that. Ambrose did not ask for more. Some sentences carry weight enough to end one conversation and quietly begin a different one in the same breath. Ambrose Thorne never stood before the valley and apologized. That was not the kind of man he was, and a winter of consequences had not remade his nature so much as revealed its limits to him. But the store reopened in March at the old prices, with no restrictions and no favorites, and no ledger of debts weighed against a family's right to eat. And every week after that, a sack of flour appeared outside the mouth of the cave, left in the frost before dawn, without a name or a note attached to it. Della knew whose hand had left it there. She never once mentioned it to her father, and he never once mentioned it to her, because there are conversations between people that are better conducted through a sack of flour left in the snow than through any words either party could manage to say aloud. Spring came to Sable Creek the way it always came to the high country of Idaho, slowly, and with a deep suspicion, as though the mountains were not yet willing to concede that winter had agreed to leave for good. The snow drew back in ragged patches. The creeks began to move again beneath their skins of rotting ice. The first green showed on the south-facing slopes where the sun struck longest and warmest. The town rebuilt, and in rebuilding, it changed. Root cellars were dug deeper and stocked earlier. 3 new storm shelters were cut into the hillside along the ridge, roofed with sound timber, and provisioned before the first leaf fell. Families began putting up their preserves in September instead of waiting for the killing frost of November to remind them. The firewood a household laid in doubled, then doubled again, and no one in the valley called it excessive anymore, because they had all seen with their own eyes what excessive preparation looked like from the inside of a warm cave while the world outside came apart. Maren stayed in the cave through it all. On the first truly warm afternoon of April, Odessa Kell climbed the hill carrying a cloth sack, moving more slowly than she had in the autumn, and Maren came down the path to meet her and took her thin arm for the last steep stretch of it. They sat together in the watery sunlight at the cave mouth, looking down on the valley where the snow was retreating in earnest now, and the first brown earth was showing through, and a hawk circled high above the ridge, first bird Maren had seen aloft in months, and they watched it together in silence until it slid away beyond the tree line and was gone. Odessa opened the sack and drew out a handful of small paper envelopes. Tomato, bean, squash, and something else Maren did not recognize by the seed. The old woman pressed the packets into her open hands and closed the girl's fingers around them with her own. You survived the winter. Her voice was quieter than it had been in the fall, but no less certain. Now you'll learn to grow something through the summer. Surviving isn't only the enduring of a thing, child. Any stone endures. Surviving is the planting of what comes after. Maren held the seed packets and felt their weight, which was almost nothing, light as a held breath, and yet contained inside their thin paper walls the entire possibility of a future that was not merely about staying alive through another dark season, but about building something that would outlast a single winter and a single girl. 3 months preparing against destruction. Now someone was asking her, at last, to prepare for growth. The difference between the two, she understood as she turned the packets over in her cracked hands, was the difference between a closed fist and an open palm. Both took strength to hold, but only one of them could carry a seed. Thank you, Odessa. The old woman patted the back of her hand and let it go. Thank me in August when you've got tomatoes fat enough to feed the whole ridge. Maren smiled. A true one, not the cautious half thing she had rationed out to the world all winter long, but a full smile that reached her eyes and changed the whole shape of her face and made her look, for one unguarded moment, exactly the age she was, 18 years old, sitting in the first real sun of the year with a handful of seeds in her lap and the entire green length of a summer waiting ahead of her. That evening, alone in the chamber with the fire banked low and the seed packets set carefully on the highest shelf where no damp could reach them, Maren took her father's sticking Tommy down from where it had leaned against the wall all winter. She had carried it out of Silas Renner's house because she could not imagine leaving it, and she had used it that first desperate day to hold her flame while she read the marks on the wall. And it had lit her way through the earliest and coldest nights when she owned almost nothing else. Now she drove its blackened iron spike into a seam in the stone beside the fire pit, working it deep and solid the way her father had driven it into the rock face every working morning of his life. And she set a fresh candle into its holder, and she lit it. The flame stood up straight and steady in the still air of the cave. It would stay there. It would not leave with her when she went down to plant a garden or come and go with the seasons. It would simply be there, a fixed light in a place her father had never seen, but would have understood better than anyone living. The iron he had carried into the dark, now holding a flame in a shelter that kept people alive. The candle holder that had begun the winter as a relic of everything she had lost had become, without her ever deciding it should, the steady lamp of everything she had built. The valley took to calling the place Hearthstone. The shame spread through Sable Creek the way good names always spread, on their own, and without anyone ever quite deciding on them, because it described what the place had come to mean: a hearth cut into a hill, a stone that held its warmth long after the fire had gone to coals, the way Ransom had first taught her the rock wood. Winter Hollow it might have been called, for what it had endured, but the valley named it for what it gave rather than what it survived. And Maren, when she heard the name for the first time from the mouth of a child down at the store, decided the valley had gotten it exactly right. Every autumn after that, when the geese knifed south in their ragged lines, and the wind swung around tasting of iron, and the first hard frost killed the last of the standing crops, someone from Sable Creek would climb the hill to Hearthstone. They would check that the firewood was stacked dry and high in its rows. They would see that the shelves were full, the flour and the salt pork and the potatoes laid in along the cold rear wall. They would clear the brush from the mouth of the passage and make certain the way in stood open. They did it without being asked and without being paid, because they remembered the winter of 1883, when a girl of 17 that the whole valley had written off as surplus had prepared better than every grown man in the settlement combined, and had then done the far harder thing, which was to open her door to the very people who had shut theirs against her. Years later, people would tell the story in a dozen different shapes. Some would make Maren older than he had been. Some would make the storm shorter, some longer. Some would forget Ambrose Thorne entirely, or fold him together with Silas into a single villain, or leave out Ransom Teal altogether because his part was the hardest to explain to anyone who had never been that alone. Stories do that. They simplify. They smooth the edges and round the numbers and lose the specific weight of individual moments in favor of a cleaner shape a person can carry easily in the mouth. The ones who had actually been inside that cave, the ones who had eaten her soup and slept against her grain sacks and watched her hands divide the food into equal portions. With a blizzard screaming on the far side of the rock, those people never once simplified it. They told the whole of it, every part, including the parts that shamed them, including the part where they laughed her out of a diner, including the part where they looked away while she walked into the snow. Because the point of it was never that Maren Pascoe had survived. Any stone survives. The point was that she survived, and then, with every reason in the world to keep it shut, she opened the door anyway. On the first morning of true spring, when the snow had pulled back far enough to show the trail clearly all the way down to the valley, Maren walked out of Hearthstone at dawn to check her rabbit snares, and she stopped where she stood. There in the thin remaining crust of frost, leading up from the tree line and ending some 20 inches short of the cave mouth, ran a line of boot prints. Large boots, a long, unhurried stride. The prints came up the hill, paused, and then turned back toward the forest, without ever approaching the entrance. Nothing had been left beside them. No rabbit hung from the branch. No coil of rope. No hatchet on the shelf. Only the prints themselves, walking up toward Hearthstone and then walking away again, as though the man who made them had come only to see for himself that the entrance stood clear and the stone above it held firm, and the girl who lived inside it was still there and still breathing. Maren stood in the pale early light and looked at those prints for a long while. Then she went back inside and she took her father's folding knife from her pocket, and she added a single new mark to the wall beside Ransom Teal's old tallies. Not a week's mark. She had no more weeks to count. Just one clean vertical line cut into the stone beside his patient hundreds. The two of them separated by 30 years, and a few inches of rock and one long winter that had taught her everything the older man had learned alone. It was the only mark she would ever make on that wall. She did not need to keep counting anymore. Counting, she understood now, was a thing a person did while waiting for something to end, and Maren Pascoe was no longer waiting.